This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Sahone, and it's Monday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. One of my goals with this series is to eventually get around to doing a top 10 on every single set. I've done 26 of them so far, which is a lot, but there's still a ton left, and today we're checking another one off the list with a look at Antiquities. Antiquities was only Magic's second ever expansion, coming after Arabian Nights in March of 1994, and it was the first set that really established some detailed lore for Magic. In particular, it focused on the story of the Brothers' War, which was the conflict between Mishra and Urza, who fought each other over a powerful ancient artifact. When trying to decide what set I wanted to take a look at next, I thought Antiquities was a good fit, since later this year we're going to get another expansion that's set during the same event, and it's fittingly called The Brothers' War. Mechanically, Antiquities was also unique in that it was a set built completely around artifacts. Every non-land card in the set either has the artifact type or the word artifact in its text box. These type of sets built around a particular card type or theme are something we're very familiar with today, but this was the first time they really went hard in one particular direction, like this. To be eligible for this list, a card had to receive its original printing in Antiquities. Overall, Antiquities is one of Magic's smallest sets ever. It's listed as having 102 cards, but several of those are just alternate arts, and there are only 85 mechanically unique cards in the set. And of those, we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Overall, Antiquities has fared pretty well, and is certainly one of the most powerful sets of all time. Of those 85 cards that received their first printing in Antiquities, 25 of them have at least 1 point using my scoring system. That's about 30%, and as we'll see, this list is a pretty impressive one, featuring many cards that have had a major impact on Magic for more than 2 decades. Before we jump into the list, I do want to say that if you enjoy my videos and you aren't already subscribed, hit the subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. Alright, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours and Players Tours. And a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, and that includes events like Grand Prix and Magic Fests. Alright, let's get to our list. At number 10, it is Atog. This 2-mana 1/2 can gobble up artifacts to get a stats boost. Notably, this was the first Atog printed, with many others printed over the years, and all of them let you consume some type of resource to give them a stats boost. If your opponent has a board full of artifacts and Atog is attacking you, it is a very real threat. It didn't gain any points as a result of this original printing, but when it was reprinted in another artifact-centric set about 10 years later, it found some success. That set was, of course, Mirrodin. It was played in some versions of Affinity in both Standard and Extended. These decks were artifact aggro decks, so Atog was a nice fit, especially when combined with a modular creature like Arcbound Ravager. However, Atog went a long time without gaining any points after 2008. That is, until Pauper became a format supported by Wizards of the Coast in 2017. Pauper is a format where only commons are legal, and Atog became a powerful card in the Pauper version of Affinity. In fact, it became such a problem in Pauper that it was banned in the format just last month. This doesn't bode well for Atog going forward, as it doesn't have much of a shot at seeing play in other formats. That said, the cards close to it in points, like Ivory Tower and Detonate, aren't seeing much play these days either. At number 9, it is Triskelion. This 6-mana creature enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters, and it can remove a counter to do 1 damage to a creature or player. This makes Triskelion quite flexible, as it can function as a creature, or a removal spell, or a way to finish off your opponent. This has led to it being a popular toolbox creature over the years, and sometimes it can also be a pretty nice combo piece. It did gain a single point in Extended as a result of this original printing, but like Atog, it didn't really find consistent success until it got a reprint in Mirrodin. As a result of that second printing, it was played as a singleton toolbox creature in Tinker decks, and later in Tron decks in Extended. In Legacy, it's been played in Survival of the Fittest decks, including a variant with a combo kill that involves putting Triskelion and Phyrexian Devourer in the graveyard with a Necrotic Ooze in play. If you did this, the Ooze would have their combined activated abilities, which means you could exile a card from the top of your library to put a counter on the Triskelion, and then remove them all to kill your opponent. It's been played the most in Vintage, though, where it has been primarily played in Mud decks. These are artifact decks that seek to produce a ton of colorless mana in a hurry, and Triskelion is something that can come down incredibly early in such a deck. It saw play in those decks for more than a decade, but it has more recently been pushed out of its slot in those decks by Walking Ballista, which comes with the same ability to remove counters, but can also gain counters and have a lot more mana pumped into it. It hasn't gained any points since 2019. At number 8, it's Shatter Storm. As I said at the beginning, almost every card in this set is artifact themed in one way or another, and some of them get there on the artifact theme by hating on them, and that's certainly what we have in Shatter Storm. This card destroys every artifact for 4 mana. Obviously enough, that's a very hard thing to come back from for any deck that is built around artifacts. Over the years, it has blown up a whole lot of artifacts, mostly in Modern, where it's been used to devastate decks like Affinity. It's still seeing sideboard play there today. At number 7, it is Energy Flux, another artifact hate card. This one makes players pay a tax of 2 mana for each of their artifacts each upkeep, and if they don't, they have to sacrifice them. This is especially potent in Vintage, where most decks run a ton of powerful artifacts. The tax from Energy Flux really makes sure that players aren't going to be able to come out ahead with their mana rocks, whether they're in the Power 9 or not. What's more is, there are several artifact-heavy decks in Vintage, with Mud and Ravager Shops being the most notable, and this really messes them up. Vintage is where it's been played the most by far, and that's something that's going to continue. At number 6, it is Ornithopter. You don't have to pay any mana to cast this 0/2 with flying. Today, it's well known that the Ornithopter is quite powerful, but believe it or not, it didn't gain any points as a result of its first printing in Antiquities. This is because there wasn't really anything that powerful you could do with it. It would take a reprint in, you guessed it, Mirrodin, for the Thopter's true power to be unlocked. That block featured a ton of artifact payoffs, more than there had ever been. Perhaps most notable was Affinity for artifacts, which automatically made any 0 mana artifact way better. In addition to that, both Arcbound Ravager and Cranial Plating could turn the Ornithopter into a very real threat. The Ornithopter has been featured in Affinity decks in Block, Standard, Modern, and Extended. More recently, it's found a lot of success in Modern's Hammer Time deck, which is all about putting equipment on your creatures quickly. One of the deck's main ways to do this is Pure Steel Paladin. Ornithopter helps you get Metalcraft going, and also happens to be a good place to put the equipment. Ornithopter has received many reprints over the years, and this has also given it legality in Standard a few more times, as well as in both Pioneer and Historic. In Standard, it's been combined with cards like Tempered Steel and Ensoul Artifact that make it a much more relevant threat. Ensoul Artifact lets you turn it into a 5/5 flyer on turn 2. It's also been quite successful in Pioneer Ensoul Artifact decks. So far, it doesn't have any points in Historic, but I wouldn't count it out there just yet. It's very likely to keep gaining points, but every single card in front of it is too. At number 5, I've got 3 cards, the Urza Lands. These are some of the few cards in the set that don't have the word artifact anywhere on them. I put them together because they're meant to be assembled together so that you can produce 7 mana with only 3 lands. In other words, they always appear together. They're often called Tron lands because they're so powerful when used together. Like many other cards on this list, the Urza Lands didn't find a whole lot of success at first, but over time it became easier to tutor up lands, and as a result, entire decks have been built around getting these 3 lands into play by turn 3, and they've found success in Standard, Extended, and especially Modern. Tron is really one of the format-defining decks of the Modern format, having been successful there since the inception of the format in 2011, and it's still relevant there today. Modern Tron decks have thrived on casting Karn Liberated or Wormcoil Engine on turn 3, and more recently the Tron lands have teamed up with Eldrazi Temple to power out Frightening Eldrazi as soon as possible. I actually did a whole episode of deck history on Tron decks, so if you want to hear me go super deep on the things these lands can do for 15 minutes, check that out. At number 4, it is Hercules Recall. This is a spell that can do a whole lot of stuff. Most obviously, it can hate on artifacts, as bouncing all of them to their owner's hand can often clear out an entire board against the right deck. And that's the way the Recall has been used the most often, as a sideboard card across multiple formats. However, it's also been used in decks that want to use the card for their own advantage. For example, some Storm decks in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage like to use it to recast a whole bunch of 0 mana artifacts, sending their Storm count through the roof and allowing them to win the game. Still, the main use of the card is as a sideboard weapon against artifact decks, and that's going to continue to be true. At number 3, it is Mishas Factory. We saw the Urza Lands earlier, and now we're seeing a card that references his brother. The Factory has a distinction as being the first creature land ever. This means it's a land, but one that can become a creature until end of turn for a cost. And the cost in this case is quite reasonable, at only 1 mana to make it into a 2/2. Creature lands are nice because they avoid sorcery speed removal, including sweepers, and you can also get them going without ever actually casting a spell, which has its obvious advantages. The Factory immediately saw play, appearing in 2 aggro decks that finished in the top 8 at Magic's first competitive event ever, Worlds in 1994. Ever since then, it's been played a ton in aggressive decks in Legacy, including Stoneblade, Merfolk, and Death and Taxes. One of the sweetest decks it's a part of, though, is Landstill. That's a deck that looks to cast Standstill and then beats the opponent down with creature lands. Because you aren't casting a spell, the Standstill doesn't do its thing, but as you attack your opponent with your factories, they're eventually going to have to do something, which means they will give you a bunch of cards. Meanwhile, in Vintage, it's largely been played in aggressive artifact decks. Mishas Factory is going to keep on gaining points. At number 2, it is Mishra's Workshop, our second consecutive Mishra land. This one can't turn into a creature. It does something way more powerful than that. It can tap for a whopping 3 mana, provided you spend it on artifacts. That's a restriction for sure, but there are enough powerful artifacts out there that this just ends up being one of the most powerful cards in the entire game. This card's power was quickly recognized, and it ended up being restricted before Worlds in 1994. This ultimately led to it never seeing any play in Standard or Extended. It also ended up getting banned in Legacy. As a result, the Workshop has only ever gained points in Magic's most powerful format, Vintage, the only format where decks can keep up with this type of fast mana. However, it has been a format-defining card in the format since Vintage began to receive more regular sanctioned events in 2005. I have mentioned Vintage Mud decks throughout this video, and this is one of the key cards in it. Sometimes they're also called Shops decks because of this card. These decks seek to produce a ton of mana and play out several artifact creatures that will kill the opponent in only 1 or 2 turns. Before Shop decks became a thing, it saw play in more prison-oriented artifact decks like Stacks. You can expect Mishra's Workshop to show up in the top 8 of just about any Vintage event, so it is going to keep gaining points. But it will probably never catch the number 1 card on this list, which is Strip Mine. This is our 3rd consecutive land, and 4 of the top 5 cards on this list were lands. Like the Urza Lands, Strip Mine doesn't actually say artifact anywhere in the text box. Instead, it can simply tap for colorless mana. Or you can tap it and sacrifice it to blow up an opposing land. Destroying an opposing land is massively powerful, so much so that this card ended up getting banned everywhere and restricted in Vintage, and that remains the case today. Vintage is the only format where it's legal, and you're only allowed that 1 copy. That 1 copy, though, is pretty much a staple, resulting in its incredibly high score despite being banned and restricted everywhere. It's very likely to hold on to its number 1 slot on this list. Well, those are the 10 cards from Antiquities that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Basically, if you're looking to build a powerful artifact deck in the Eternal formats, or hate on powerful artifact decks in that format, you're probably running some cards from Antiquities. If you want to own any of these powerful cards, check out the description where you'll find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to stay aware of future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, including several more that look at the best cards in specific sets, you should see the playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.